Hello, and welcome to the Critical Path Institute podcast. Our goal for this podcast is to connect the dots among our core competencies in regulatory science, biomarkers, data management and standards, clinical outcome assessments, and modeling and analytics, and how we accelerate drug development. CPath created this podcast for researchers, clinicians, and industry and regulatory professionals with the hope that these conversations and the resources we share will advance your efforts and partnerships to improve global health.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the long-awaited inaugural episode for the Critical Path Institute's podcast, where we connect the dots between drug development, medicine, science, and public health. I'm Klaus Romero. I'm the CEO for Critical Path Institute, this amazing nonprofit organization where we run collaborations to accelerate drug development by turning data into actionable solutions that remove bottlenecks from the process. I'm a clinician who likes numbers. Today I'm here with Dr. Cheryl Coon, another one of our talented VPs. Cheryl, welcome. Can you tell us something about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Klaus. I joined CPath 2 years ago, coming up on 2 years ago, and I was a consultant for a long time. But the maybe fun fact about myself is that I became a yoga teacher during COVID. And in doing my yoga teacher training, I was kind of seeing the world from a different angle, a different viewpoint, and really seeing that patient care, individuals was so necessary. And I wasn't feeling that connection through my consulting career. So that's when I turned to CPath because I knew I could make a bigger impact and make a difference here.
Fantastic. Now let's talk about your title. You're the Vice President for the Clinical Outcome Assessment Program. That's a mouthful. Can you explain what it is, what you do, and how all that works?
Yeah, so clinical outcome assessments are tools to measure how patients feel, function, and survive. And many people have probably seen a clinical outcome assessment. You go to your doctor and they ask you to fill out a questionnaire before the doctor comes in. It might be an anxiety screener or something to just kind of see how are you doing. And we use those in clinical trials to standardize measurement of how people are feeling and functioning because we've got to understand that to know if a therapy is actually providing clinical benefit. That's the thing that the regulators are really trying to assess when they're reviewing drugs and their efficacy. So the clinical outcome assessment tools are critical to deciding if a drug is effective or not. So my team, I'm very lucky to be able to work with a group of psychometricians, qualitative experts, people who have been working in this field for a long time, trying to quantify the patient experience. And we work on developing those tools, on evaluating those tools, and generating the right evidence for regulatory requirements.
That was super helpful, Cheryl. Thank you. So it seems like you are at the center of connecting the day-to-day experience of people with conditions who participate in trials and how to capture those experiences in a scientifically rigorous way to help understand the efficacy and the safety of new drugs. That seems pretty important. Can you help us understand how that link between something that seems so subjective with something that seems so objective actually happens?
That is a loaded question right there because subjective is sometimes a pejorative term, but we use that term in a very positive way because subjective means that the person who's having that experience is the center. They are that source of data. And we have to use our rigorous qualitative and quantitative methodology to create questions that allow for consistent answers by the same person over time, over a trial, as well as across people. It doesn't mean that a 5 on a pain scale for one person has to be a 5 on that pain scale for another person. They need to be in the same range for sure. but you're measuring the same person over time. And as long as a 5 is the same place on the scale across a year trial, then you know that you're going to have that internal consistency, and that with in-person change is going to be reliable. Reliability is a big part of what we do, and the other part of it is validity, making sure that we're measuring the thing that actually matters to people. And that's also where that subjectivity is a positive thing, because what matters to an individual is the thing that we want to be able to quantify. When we talk about objective tools and people use that as a positive thing, that objectivity might be a little bit more disconnected from the person's experience. And if I'm going to my doctor, I want to tell them about what I'm experiencing, not what they think that they want to know about me. I want to tell them my personal experience, and that's what our questionnaires are able to do, and do it in a way that's reliable, valid, and a score means something so that the regulators can make decisions based on it. But more importantly, once that decision's made and the drug is available, patients then can go look at that information. They can see what happened in the trial and how that might link back to their expectations if they were to go on that treatment. It helps with treatment-making decisions for the patient as well as the clinicians that are helping them to navigate those choices.
That's awesome because, as you put it, who matters in the end is who is going to be using those drugs once they get to the market. And so ignoring that as you test things in clinical trials was a big issue in the past, and you're addressing that in a truly positive way. So that's fantastic. And it helps making sure that the scientific rigor that is used to determine the efficacy or the safety of a given drug actually connects with the human experience. That's pretty awesome. Can you share the different types of metrics and instruments that are used depending on who provides the information and how all those things interact with each other?
Sure. So the one that is maybe the most common are patient-reported outcome measures. That means that the patient themselves is filling out the questionnaire and picking the choices for themselves. Sometimes patients can't self-report. Maybe it's a young child and they're a little bit too young to be able to read the questionnaire or to understand what their experience is. Or maybe it's somebody with a cognitive deficiency and are unable to complete the questionnaire. In those cases, we could use an observer-reported outcome measure where someone is observing them on a daily basis, a caregiver, a partner, and responding on their observations. They're not responding in place of the person. They're not saying this person feels this pain, but they're observing behaviors, signs that are associated with probably what's happening in that person. Clinician-reported outcome measures are certainly common. Our primary care physicians use them all the time, and they are also used in clinical trials in cases where the clinician might be the best observer and rater of certain things, such as in Parkinson's disease, motor functioning, if they can move their hands and move their body in a certain way, what tremor might look like, or rigidity. Those are things that might be best measured by a clinician or rated by a clinician. Doesn't mean that we don't ask the patient, though, how they're feeling. That's a separate instrument, and that's fine. We can use them in partnership in clinical trials. And then the fourth bucket are performance outcome measures. And those are like the 6-minute walk test is a very common one. You go into the clinic and you're asked to walk for 6 minutes, and how far can you make it? That starts to get a little bit into maybe a topic that's on your list, Klaus, but I'll go there right now, which is digital health technologies, where everybody's got an Apple Watch or Fitbit or something on their wrist these days, and that's collecting data. It's collecting data about how your walking ability is in your daily life. And so that's also within that clinical outcome assessment spectrum can we use those pieces of information to also understand how people are feeling or functioning? Are they moving more over time? Is their step count increasing? So we've got a lot of different ways to connect back to feels and functions.
And that was fantastic, because the connection with how people feel and or function is key, because at the end of the day, the efficacy of a new drug matters way more when it affects, in a positive way, how people feel and function, along with other metrics. But let's talk about the other types of measurements that occur in clinical trials. And I've seen that some people treat them separately, but I'm not sure that they are so disconnected. One thing is all the metrics that you described that capture how people are functioning and surviving. And then the other metrics are lab tests and imaging tests, aka biomarkers, and how they are looking inside the body, so to speak, as to biological characteristics that can also help understand how the drug is moving to the body or how the body's responding to the drug. But they ought to be related and not separate measures. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, this goes back to the first question you asked about what are clinical outcome assessments. So they are assessments of clinical outcomes, and then how are clinical outcomes used? Well, that's where the clinical benefit in that regulatory review comes in. So a clinical benefit is a positive, clinically meaningful effect of an intervention. That's what regulators are looking for. Is there a clinically meaningful effect that's happening from this new therapy that's been developed? That, in the actual definition, it says, i.e., a positive effect on how an individual feels, functions, or survives. So it's that actual patient experience that means that something has a clinical benefit. Now, we can't always measure that, or maybe we don't want to measure that. So blood pressure, for example. The thing that we really care about, the clinically meaningful benefit, are people having cardiac events? Are people dying? We don't want those things to happen. So we don't want to run trials for years and years and wait for people to die at the end and say, okay, this didn't work and this did over here because in 5 years, these people didn't die. We don't want to design trials like that. We need to have alternatives to that. And that's where blood pressure readings come in. So we can tell by what somebody's blood pressure reading is, what the kind of probability is of those events, the clinically meaningful events, and it becomes kind of a stand-in. It's an understanding of the biological process or what's going on in the body that could lead to the thing that we're trying to avoid or the thing that we're trying to promote. So they are interrelated, but that biomarker, like the blood pressure reading, it has to have some connection to clinical benefit, because if it doesn't, blood pressure on its own, I don't know I'm sitting here now, I have no idea what my blood pressure is. But I'm hoping it's low enough because that means my heart and cardiovascular system is hopefully in a healthy place that will keep me going for a long time.
And we want that. That was a fantastic example of how we connect the dots at CPATH. But let's get back to something that you mentioned before, digital health technologies and wearable sensors, smartphones, and things of that nature. They can measure a lot of things, some things that are very easy to capture with technology, but that may not necessarily mean that that's the thing that really matters to measure. And you've taken certain journeys in that direction in orienting how to optimize that landscape. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I feel like as consumers, we're getting kind of used to looking at our step count or looking at the numbers that are coming out of our devices. I'm a mountain biker, and my friends all use their Garmins and are reporting out on Strava at the end of the rides. The metrics mean things to them. I know, if I climb 2,500 feet in elevation, that was a good ride. But how do I know that? how does that connect back to the things that make me happy or make me feel and function well? And when we're developing assessments for these clinical trials, we have to start with the people themselves, with qualitative research. The data will come, and there's so much that we can do with data. And I'm a data person. I'm a psychometrician. Put me in SAS with data, and I can't wait to explore and see what happens. But I've got to understand where the data are coming from for me to interpret what those numbers mean. So starting with individual interviews with people who have the experience, who have a certain condition, and finding out what is meaningful to them is the baseline for any clinical outcome assessment work that we do. So, for example, within our patient-reported outcome consortium, which is one of the 3 consortia within our COA program, they have several working groups that are tied to specific therapeutic areas, and there's one for chronic heart failure. They're developing 2 patient-reported outcome measures. They're also developing a DHT-based outcome measure on, it's a step count-based metric. And step count itself, kind of meaningful, but what is it really tying back to? They started with qualitative research to talk to people with chronic heart failure, to ask what are the things that matter in your life, and if there was a new therapy, what would you want to see improve? And it was things like, I want to be able to walk down the street to take my grandchild to school. That requires walking, it requires steps, and throughout the qualitative interviews, there were examples like that where the step count shows up in people's lives. And if step count could be improved, we know that their feeling and functioning in their lives could be improved. So that's how we are grounding our metrics back to the individual experience of people who will ultimately hopefully be benefiting from the drug, because that's the thing that they want to do. They want to take the medication and walk their grandkids to school. They don't necessarily want to maybe they want to hit their 10,000 steps for the day, but why do they want to do that? Because there's something at the end of those 10,000 steps that means something to them.
Another fantastic example of connecting the dots. But then you talked about the PRO consortium, and that's one of the consortia that live within the program you lead. Can you help us understand what those consortia are and the main areas of focus that they're working on right now?
Yeah. So the PRO consortium was founded in late 2008. So we're going on 17 years here with the work that they're doing. They're focused on developing instruments for clinical trials, and they have a long history of success with that. They have had several instruments. The FDA has this qualification process where instruments, tools, biomarkers as well can go through this process. And if the evidence adds up to saying, yes, this is reliable and valid and meaningful, they will give it sort of a stamp of approval called qualification, saying this can now be used in a specific context of use. Maybe we'll get to what that term means in a minute. But they are developing this so that everybody can use the same instruments. And the benefit for that is, A, it's ready to go, which means pharmaceutical companies don't have to spend time and resources to develop something new. They can generally kind of plug and play it. And then all the different trials will have the same instruments. So now you can start comparing across trials. You can start to get the community very familiar with the instruments because, they're new and they might not be ones that are used often in clinic. But as people use them, we get used to them. And suddenly, just like we know 120/80 is good for blood pressure, we'll know what an 8 means on this instrument that's used very frequently. So they're not just about qualification, though, because it's a lengthy process. And in that period of time, there's so much more that can be done. Part of it is helping sponsors navigate regulatory expectations in general outside of qualification. How can they be doing their own work on their end for their tools to meet those expectations. And so they're in close contact, not only with sort of a community of other pharmaceutical companies learning from each other, but also in frequent touch with the FDA themselves on topics that impact everybody. So we get to talk about all sorts of cool methodological questions that I won't geek out about now, but just kind of bringing everybody to the same playing field so that we can understand what evidence is needed, how do we generate it, and what are best practices. And it's not just FDA, it's also EMA, it's also the health technology assessments, which is, now it's been approved, will it actually be paid for? That's a big question, because now we're talking about, is the cost supporting the benefit that you're getting? Is it not just outweighing the risks that go with it? So I can get into all those tools. I don't know how much time we have, because I also want to talk about the other two consortia that we have. So that was 2008. A few years later, in 2011, what is now called the COA consortium was founded. So that is the electronic COA consortium. They are focused on knowing that in a clinical trial, we've got to have data generated in a consistent way, not just because we've created the items with the patients to measure it well, but also on a device that people can use, that it interacts with the technology that the sites are using, that the pharmaceutical companies are using. And it's basically the electronic collection of data on phones, on tablets, on wearable devices, and best practices around that. And that is really critical, because that is the rate limiting factor. I can click a box on my phone to say, here's how I feel today. But if my phone is not relaying that in a reliable way, if the screen is off, or if I had to scroll through several pages and I couldn't even find the right answer for me, suddenly the data become unusable. And then there's the whole tracking on the back end, where it gets collected and it has to be stored and then transferred. There's a lot of work there. So there is a consortium dedicated to that. And the people who are associated with that are clinical research organizations, device companies, and the providers of those tools that are working anyways on a daily basis with the pharmaceutical companies. So we wanted to make sure that they had a place where they could come together and get their own methodology and best practices established. So those two consortia work very closely together, obviously. But then in 2022, there was identified a need for the methodology that we're using, applying it to rare disease and the nuances that go there. So the Rare Disease COA Consortium was established then. And in rare disease, we have small sample sizes. We have a community that is spread out and maybe hard to reach. And we can't just start from the beginning and follow the same path necessarily. We might not have the statistical power to do all the cool psychometrics that I would want to do. And we might actually have a good starting base somewhere else. So what that consortium is focused on is leveraging what exists already and learning from other rare diseases so that we can use similar instruments across rare diseases. It doesn't mean, I used the plug and play analogy before. We can't just plug one in and put it somewhere else. We do have to have some evidence there, because that's where that context of use comes in. Where is this going to be used? If it's going to be used in lysosomal disorders of some sort, we have to make sure it's appropriate there if we pulled it from a completely different therapeutic area. But that consortium is really focused on, they're all focused on speeding up drug development, because they're all at CPATH. But in particular for rare disease, because we've got to accelerate the availability of new therapies that are being developed. And those sponsors often don't have the funding to go out and do the start to finish work on COAs. So this is helping them find what will work in their trials so that they can speed things up on their end and save money, apply that money elsewhere.
That was a fantastic overview of your program and the 3 consortia that are within the program, now the audience understands why the COA program represents one of our key core competencies in clinical outcome assessment. So that was fantastic. And you mentioned something that I want to get back to. Avoid reinventing the wheel, right? Because there are times when you need to invent a new wheel when the unmet need calls for that. But there are times where you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You just need to adapt a wheel for a use that actually gets you to understanding the benefit of a potential new drug. And linked to that is the context. And you mentioned a term a couple of times, the context of use statement. That's the foundation for every single tool that we generate. But in the context of the tools that you work on, can you help us understand the concept and why it's so important?
Well, it's a regulatory expectation, so that's one of the reasons it's so important. But we have to make sure that we're measuring the right thing for the right people, and that's basically the context of use. Who are the people that we're trying to help? And are we measuring the things that matter to them, or maybe measuring things that matter to other people, the general population? There are instruments that have been developed, such as the PROMIS health measures. There's an item bank that was funded in part by NIH and it's a huge item bank. And I know that it's being used in clinical practice because my mom gets those items, and we've talked about those items that she's seeing in her from her primary care physician. So those are great for general population, but can we pull that and plug it into a clinical trial? Maybe. But we've got to do some work to make sure that those items actually are fit for the purpose that they're going to be used for. So it might be that it's been developed for the general population, but will it work in an elderly population? We do a little bit more work to make sure. We go back and do some qualitative research to say, okay, this worked in this big picture, but for this group of patients over here, is it still working? Are the concepts still relevant for them? Are they worded in a way that they understand? In that case, in the PROMIS case, they've done so much qualitative research, often that the wording is not the question, but it's really those concepts. Is it pinpointing when a person is improving? Because we want to make sure that we are narrowing that place on that scale and saying, yes, they have benefited from this therapy, and we feel really confident that that has happened. And that's the context of use, is making sure that we're narrowing that sort of error bar around the measurement. Because if you can narrow that, it translates into power, and it translates into the fact that the trial is now going to be set up to tell you if a drug is effective or not.
That was probably one of the best explanations I have heard about the concept of the context of use, which is key to understanding the work that we do at CPATH and the solutions that we generate. So thank you for that, Cheryl. To connect the dot with everything, your program is planning a pretty big meeting in the DC area coming up, and I think that could be a very exciting opportunity to see how it all fits together. Can you tell us about the meeting?
Yeah, this is our 16th year holding this annual meeting. It is April 9th and 10th of 2025 this year. And it's a day and a half of a full day, and then a half day to allow people to get home should they want to. And we always try to pick topics that are timely, and they are the things that people are struggling with. It's the questions that people are navigating on their own. So let's get sessions together that are actually going to try to address it, either by success stories that people have had, or just a public discussion where we can all come together and try to navigate something together. An example of that this year is that, of course, because it's 2025 and AI is everywhere, we will have a session on AI. For us in the COA space, AI is brand new, and, well, it's new for everybody, but it's really new, and there's really no guidances or clear understanding of what to do with it and what boxes we need to check if we're going to use it. So we're going to explore that in a session and try to get people on the same page. People who don't know about AI will learn kind of what it is and how it's being used, and people who are using it can talk about the risks that they're countering and how to mitigate some of those risks. So that's just one session, and that's going to be a pretty rich one. Other sessions are about the accessibility of these tools in clinical trials for people who might need accommodations, and are the devices, the wearables or the iPads that people are using, are they actually working for the people who are real life people, and they have their own sort of physical limitations or physical accommodations that they might need? Are we placing undue burden on them by using those? So navigating that. We have a session dedicated on rare disease, of course, because that is something that just needs a spotlight shown on it. And then we have a session on labeling, which is kind of the communication of this information back to patients, back to clinicians, and the regulatory kind of framework around that. Because once you get a drug approved, the actual communication about what was in that trial is a whole different process and a whole different set of requirements and limitations sometimes. What can you say and what can you not say? And then finally, taking 10 steps back, thinking about the big picture and the whole landscape of all the different stakeholders that this matters to. Like I said earlier, it's not just FDA. That's US. There's a whole globe out there, and people live everywhere, and people need therapies everywhere. So what are the expectations elsewhere? What are the HTA expectations, those health technology groups that are assessing the benefit against the cost? And how is that connecting back to the patients and clinicians themselves? So kind of the whole life cycle of where can COAs fit in and how are people using them? So that's the big picture of the meeting, kind of something for everyone, no matter where you sit. If you sit in a pharmaceutical company, of course, if you're in a COA team, this, as I've been told, this is the premier COA meeting, so be there. But if you sit in clinical operations or if you sit in regulatory affairs, there are things to learn from this meeting, because this all fits into that context of your clinical trial and how the data are used, who's using them, and what do, maybe not you, but your team, your coworkers, what do they need to be doing so that you've got what you need to put it into a package?
Yeah, I'm so looking forward to the meeting. So everybody's welcome to join us and Cheryl in DC for that fantastic set of interactions. Cheryl, this was great. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm going to make the prediction that this is going to be one of the most viewed episodes of the podcast, which is fantastic. So thank you again, and we'll see everybody in DC, hopefully.
Thank you, Klaus. This was really fun. I love nerding out on clinical outcome assessments and really showing why they matter and why we work so hard at them. It's all about the patients.
Fantastic. Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, everybody. We'll see you in the next episode.
Did you enjoy this episode? Share it with a friend or colleague, or leave a review on iTunes, and help others discover and support our mission. We are welcoming guests with a range of experiences and viewpoints. The views expressed belong to the guests themselves. Learn more about Critical Path Institute at cpath.org. That's c-path.org. Stay tuned for our next episode coming soon, and thanks for listening.